Picture this: a soft-spoken teacher who flinches at raised voices, stumbles over her words during parent conferences, and gets overlooked in every faculty meeting. Now imagine that same woman unleashing years of military combat training on a group of teenage tormentors who pushed her one step too far. What happens next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about quiet strength and the explosive power that lies beneath a gentle surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just another school story, it's a masterclass in patience, precision, and the devastating consequences of underestimating the wrong person. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Middle School like impatient fingers, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the chaos that defined the final hour of each school day. Inside room 237, mathematics textbooks lay scattered across desks while erasers bounced off walls and paper airplanes sailed through the air with reckless abandon. At the front of the classroom, 34-year-old Jessica Martinez stood perfectly still, her small frame dwarfed by the whiteboard behind her, watching the mayhem unfold with the resigned expression of someone who had long ago stopped expecting miracles. Jessica had been teaching at Riverside for 3 years, and in that time, she had earned a reputation that followed her through every hallway conversation and staff meeting whisper. "Poor Jessica," they would say, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and frustration. "She just can't control a classroom. The kids walk all over her." It was true, though not in the way her colleagues imagined. Jessica Martinez possessed the rare and unfortunate combination of genuine kindness and crippling social anxiety, a pairing that had made her teenage years miserable and her teaching career an uphill battle against her own nature. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length black hair that she habitually tucked behind her ears when nervous, Jessica looked more like a graduate student than a seasoned educator. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of cardigans in muted colors, knee-length skirts, and sensible flats that made no sound as she moved through the school's corridors. She spoke in measured tones, never raising her voice above a whisper, and had developed the habit of apologizing for everything from minor scheduling changes to asking students to turn in their homework. The administrators had tried pairing her with veteran teachers, sending her to classroom management workshops, and even suggesting she consider a different career path. But Jessica persisted with the quiet determination of someone who genuinely believed education could change lives. What nobody at Riverside Middle School knew, what Jessica had never shared with another living soul since arriving in this small Colorado town, was that the woman who flinched at loud noises and stumbled through parent-teacher conferences had spent 8 years as a hand-to-hand combat instructor for the United States Marine Corps. Before she became Jessica Martinez, the math teacher, she had been Staff Sergeant Jessica Rodriguez, a woman who could incapacitate a grown man in under 10 seconds and had trained hundreds of Marines in techniques that could stop a heart or break bones with surgical precision. The transformation from warrior to wallflower hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual metamorphosis born from trauma, guilt, and a desperate desire to distance herself from a past that haunted her dreams and followed her into every quiet moment. After her discharge from the military, Jessica had changed her name, moved 3,000 miles from her family in San Antonio, and enrolled in a teacher certification program with the naive hope that surrounding herself with children and mathematics would somehow heal the wounds that military counselors had failed to address. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, as October rain continued its relentless assault on the school's aging windows, Jessica was attempting to explain the concept of negative integers to her 7th grade pre-algebra class when the familiar sound of disruption began to escalate beyond her usual tolerance level. It started, as it always did, with Marcus Thompson, a 13-year-old who had been held back twice and towered over his classmates like a menacing giant. Marcus had the unfortunate distinction of being both academically behind and physically intimidating, a combination that had made him the unofficial leader of a small group of troublemakers who seemed to view Jessica's classroom as their personal playground. Marcus sat in the back corner of the room, his long legs stretched into the aisle, deliberately blocking the path Jessica needed to walk to reach the other students. His dirty blonde hair hung in greasy strands across his forehead, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had learned early that size and aggression could compensate for a lack of intelligence. Beside him sat his constant companion, Dylan Carter, a wiry kid with nervous energy and a mouth that never seemed to close. Dylan served as Marcus's amplifier, taking every cruel comment and broadcasting it to the rest of the class with the enthusiasm of a sports commentator. The third member of their group was Brianna Walsh, a girl whose early physical development had given her a dangerous kind of power over her peers and an inflated sense of her own importance. With her carefully straightened blonde hair and makeup that violated every school dress code, Brianna had appointed herself the queen of 7th grade and viewed Jessica's quiet demeanor as a personal affront to her authority. She had perfected the art of the eye roll, the dismissive laugh, and the whispered comment that could cut deeper than any shouted insult. Today's disruption began when Marcus announced to the room that he didn't understand why they needed to learn about negative numbers since negative people like Miss Martinez already existed in the world. The comment drew snickers from several students, and Dylan immediately seized the opportunity to elaborate on the theme. "Yeah, she's so negative she makes us all depressed just looking at her," he added, his voice carrying that particular tone of adolescent cruelty that could make even adults wince. Jessica felt the familiar flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but she continued writing on the whiteboard, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt in her chest. She had learned through years of trial and error that responding to these comments only encouraged more of them, and her strategy had always been to ignore the behavior and hope it would fade away on its own. Unfortunately, her silence had the opposite effect on Marcus, Dylan, and Brianna, who interpreted her lack of response as permission to escalate their campaign of casual cruelty. "Miss Martinez," Brianna called out in a voice dripping with false sweetness, "why do you always wear those same ugly cardigans? Don't teachers make enough money to buy real clothes?" The question was punctuated by a series of giggles from her followers, and Jessica could feel the attention of the entire class focusing on her with the intensity of a spotlight. She turned from the whiteboard, her dark eyes meeting Brianna's blue ones for just a moment before she looked away, her voice barely audible as she attempted to redirect the conversation back to mathematics. "Let's focus on the lesson, please," Jessica said, her words carrying no authority whatsoever. "We need to understand how to work with negative numbers before tomorrow's quiz." The mention of a quiz should have captured their attention, but instead, it seemed to provide Marcus with new ammunition for his assault on her credibility. "Quiz?" Marcus laughed, slapping his hand on his desk with enough force to make several students jump. "Lady, half the class is failing already, and you want to give us more tests? Maybe you should quiz yourself on how to actually teach something, instead of just standing up there mumbling about numbers nobody cares about." The insult was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, and the resulting laughter from his peers seemed to fuel his growing boldness. Jessica's fingers tightened around the dry erase marker in her hand, and for just a moment, muscle memory from her military training flickered through her consciousness. She remembered the weight of authority in her voice when she had commanded respect from Marines twice Marcus's size. Remembered the crisp efficiency of movements that could end a confrontation before it truly began. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But that was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was dead and buried beneath years of deliberate forgetting and careful reconstruction. The harassment continued for the remaining 20 minutes of the class period, with Marcus Dylan and Brianna taking turns making increasingly personal comments about Jessica's appearance, her teaching ability, and her general worth as a human being. The other students in the class watched with the uncomfortable fascination of witnesses to a car accident, some clearly disturbed by what they were seeing, but lacking the courage or social capital to intervene. Jessica endured it all with the practiced stoicism of someone who had survived much worse, counting down the minutes until the bell would release her from this particular form of torture. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Jessica felt a familiar wave of relief wash over her. The other students gathered their belongings and hurried toward the door, eager to begin their after-school activities or head home to the comfort of families who presumably treated them with basic human dignity. Marcus, Dylan, and Brianna, however, seemed to be in no hurry to leave. They remained in their seats, exchanging looks that Jessica had learned to recognize as the prelude to something worse than their usual classroom disruptions. "Hey, Miss Martinez," Marcus called out as the last of the other students disappeared into the hallway. "We need to talk to you about something." His tone had shifted from the performative cruelty he displayed in front of an audience to something more personal and threatening. Jessica's internal alarm system, honed by years of military training and situational awareness, began to signal danger, but she forced herself to maintain her usual demeanor of quiet compliance. "I'm afraid I need to prepare for tomorrow's lessons," Jessica replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the room. "If you have concerns about your grades or the material, we can schedule a conference during my planning period." She began gathering her papers and books, hoping that the appearance of dismissal would encourage them to leave. But Marcus stood up from his desk and moved to block her path to the door. At 13, Marcus already stood nearly 6 feet tall, with the kind of broad shoulders and thick build that promised he would be truly formidable once he finished growing. His presence in the small classroom suddenly felt overwhelming, and Jessica realized that the dynamic had shifted from public humiliation to something potentially more dangerous. Dylan and Brianna flanked him, their earlier amusement replaced by something harder and more focused. "See, that's the problem," Marcus continued, taking a step closer to Jessica's desk. "You keep acting like you're actually a teacher, like you deserve to be here telling us what to do. But everybody knows you're a joke. The other teachers talk about you in the hallways. They say you're pathetic, that you should have been fired years ago." The words were delivered with surgical precision, designed to hit exactly where they would cause the most damage. Jessica set down her papers and looked up at Marcus, her brown eyes steady despite the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach. "Marcus, you need to leave my classroom now. The school day is over, and you're not supposed to be here without supervision." Her voice carried a note of authority that hadn't been there moments before, a subtle shift that Marcus noticed but chose to ignore. "Or what?" Dylan chimed in, his nervous energy manifesting as a high-pitched giggle that set Jessica's teeth on edge. "You going to call the principal? Tell him we hurt your feelings? Face it, lady, nobody's going to help you because nobody cares about you." He moved closer as well, and Jessica realized that they had effectively surrounded her, blocking all potential exits from the room. Brianna stepped forward, her young face twisted into an expression of cruel satisfaction. "My mom works at the school district office," she said, her voice taking on the sing-song quality of someone delivering particularly devastating news. "She says there's a whole file on you, complaints from parents about how their kids aren't learning anything in your class. She says they're just waiting for an excuse to get rid of you." The girl's smile was sharp as a blade, and Jessica felt something cold settle in her chest. The 3 students began to close in around Jessica's desk, their body language shifting from typical teenage posturing to something more predatory. Marcus reached out and knocked over a cup of pencils, sending them scattering across the floor with a sound like falling rain. Dylan swept a stack of papers off the desk, letting them flutter to the ground in a cascade of white. Brianna picked up Jessica's grade book and held it over her head, threatening to throw it across the room. "Stop," Jessica said, her voice quiet, but carrying a new edge that none of them had heard before. "Put that down and leave my classroom immediately." She stood up from her chair, her small frame still dwarfed by the teenagers surrounding her, but something in her posture had changed. Her shoulders had straightened, her chin had lifted, and her hands had moved to her sides in a position that looked casual, but would allow for instant defensive action. Marcus laughed, interpreting her movement as an attempt at intimidation rather than preparation. "Oh, look at that, guys. The mouse is trying to roar." He reached across the desk and grabbed Jessica's arm, his large hand encircling her wrist with room to spare. "Maybe if you got down on your knees and begged us to stop, we might consider leaving you alone." The suggestion was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never been forced to face the consequences of his actions. For Jessica Martinez, formerly Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the moment Marcus's hand closed around her wrist was the moment 8 years of careful control began to crack. The physical contact triggered responses that had been buried but never truly eliminated. Muscle memory that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. Her body recognized the grip as a precursor to violence, and systems that had been dormant for years suddenly came online with devastating efficiency. "Let go of me," Jessica said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout could have managed. "Let go of me right now." The words were delivered with the kind of quiet authority that had once made Marines snap to attention. But Marcus was too caught up in his perceived dominance to recognize the warning. Instead of releasing her, Marcus tightened his grip and pulled Jessica closer to him, his face inches from hers as he prepared to deliver what he clearly intended to be the final humiliation in their campaign of harassment. "Make me," he whispered back, his breath hot against her face. "What are you going to do about it, teacher?" Dylan and Brianna moved closer, eager to witness what they expected to be Jessica's complete breakdown. The room was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the barely audible hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Time seemed to slow as Jessica looked into Marcus's eyes and saw not just the casual cruelty of a teenager, but the entitled arrogance of someone who had never learned that actions have consequences. In that moment, Jessica Martinez made a decision that would change everything. The careful barriers she had built between her past and present began to crumble, and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez started to emerge from the grave where she had been buried. Jessica's free hand moved with the speed and precision of a striking snake, her fingers finding the pressure point just below Marcus's elbow and applying exactly the right amount of force to send lightning bolts of pain shooting up his arm. Marcus's grip on her wrist released instantly as he stumbled backward, clutching his arm and staring at Jessica with a mixture of shock and confusion. The casual confidence that had carried him through years of bullying evaporated in an instant, replaced by the dawning realization that he had made a serious miscalculation. Dylan and Brianna froze, their earlier bravado disappearing as they witnessed something they had never seen before, their leader in retreat. "I told you to let go," Jessica said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who is accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I told you to leave my classroom. You chose not to listen." She remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed but somehow radiating potential energy, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. Marcus shook his arm, trying to restore feeling to the limb that had suddenly become unreliable. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. For the first time in his young life, he was facing someone who was not intimidated by his size or his reputation, someone who had responded to his aggression with a level of controlled violence that he was completely unprepared to handle. "I defended myself," Jessica replied, taking a small step forward that somehow managed to push all 3 students back toward the door. Something I learned a long time ago in a place where bullies like you wouldn't last 5 minutes. Her dark eyes moved from Marcus to Dylan to Brianna, and each of them felt the weight of her attention like a physical force. Dylan, who had built his entire social identity around being Marcus's loyal sidekick, found himself facing the terrifying prospect that his protection might not be as absolute as he had believed. "You can't touch us," he said, but his voice cracked on the words, betraying his fear. "Teachers aren't allowed to hurt students. You'll get fired. You'll go to jail." Jessica's smile was as cold as winter rain. "Touch you?" she repeated, her tone suggesting that Dylan had just said something particularly amusing. "I haven't touched anyone. Marcus grabbed me, and I made him let go. That's called self-defense, and it's perfectly legal." She took another step forward, and the 3 students found themselves pressed against the classroom door. Brianna, who had spent years perfecting the art of social manipulation, tried to regain control of the situation through the only means she knew. "Wait until I tell my mom about this," she threatened, her voice shrill with panic. "She'll have you fired so fast your head will spin. You're finished at this school. You're finished everywhere." The threat was delivered with the conviction of someone who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through parental intervention. Jessica nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering Brianna's words. "Your mother works at the district office," she said, her voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than any shout would have been. "That's interesting. I wonder what she'll say when she sees the security footage from this classroom. I wonder how she explained why her daughter was participating in the harassment of a teacher after school hours." She gestured toward the corner of the room where a small security camera had been recording everything that had happened. The blood drained from Brianna's face as she followed Jessica's gesture and saw the red light that indicated the camera was active. In all their months of tormenting their quiet math teacher, none of them had considered that their actions might be documented, that there might be consequences beyond Jessica's tears and resignation. Marcus, still clutching his arm, tried to salvage something from the wreckage of his authority. "This isn't over," he said, but the words came out as more of a plea than a threat. "You think you're tough now, but we'll see what happens tomorrow. We'll see what happens when everyone knows what you did to me." He was reaching for his old pattern of intimidation, but the words felt hollow even to him. Jessica's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes grew harder. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet finality that made strong men step aside, "if you ever put your hands on me again, if you ever threaten me again, if you ever try to turn my classroom into your personal playground again, I will show you exactly what I learned during 8 years in the United States Marine Corps. And I promise you, it will be an educational experience you will never forget." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. The 3 students stared at Jessica with new eyes, suddenly seeing not the timid math teacher they had tormented for months, but something else entirely. The woman standing before them had shed her cardigan like a snake shedding its skin, revealing something that had been hidden beneath layers of deliberate meekness and carefully constructed vulnerability. Dylan was the first to break, pushing past Marcus to reach the door handle. "We need to go," he said, his voice high and panicked. "We need to go right now." He yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, with Brianna close behind him. Marcus lingered for a moment, his pride warring with his newly discovered sense of self-preservation. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the words had no power behind them. Jessica watched him with the patient expression of someone who had faced down real threats and found teenage bravado utterly unimpressive. Marcus's nerve finally broke, and he fled through the door, leaving Jessica alone in her classroom with the scattered papers and the profound silence that follows a storm. Jessica stood perfectly still for several minutes, allowing her heartbeat to return to normal and her breathing to slow. The transformation back to her civilian identity was always jarring, like waking from a vivid dream to find herself in an unfamiliar place. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were steady, professional, unremarkable. But she could still feel the ghost of muscle memory, the phantom weight of authority that had carried her through 8 years of military service. Moving with deliberate care, Jessica began to collect the scattered papers from the floor. Each sheet had to be sorted, organized, and returned to its proper place, a task that served as both practical necessity and therapeutic ritual. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the choice she had just made, the barrier she had just crossed. For 3 years, she had endured harassment, disrespect, and casual cruelty in the name of maintaining her carefully constructed new identity. Today, that identity had cracked, revealing something that could not be unseen or unforgotten. The security camera in the corner of the room continued its silent vigil, and Jessica found herself wondering what story the footage would tell. Would it show a teacher defending herself against aggressive students? Or would it reveal the moment when Jessica Martinez's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled? She suspected that the truth lay somewhere between those two interpretations, in the gray area where past and present collided with unpredictable results. As she straightened the last stack of papers on her desk, Jessica caught her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her was still small, still wearing the same conservative clothing and sensible shoes, but something fundamental had changed. The hunted look that had haunted her eyes for years was gone, replaced by something harder and more confident. She looked like someone who had stopped running from herself. The rain continued to fall against the windows of room 237, washing the world clean and carrying away the last traces of autumn warmth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new tests of the fragile balance between who Jessica had been and who she was trying to become. But tonight, for the first time in years, she felt like she could face whatever came next. Jessica gathered her belongings and turned off the classroom lights, leaving the security camera to record nothing but empty desks and the soft patter of rain against glass. As she walked through the quiet hallways of Riverside Middle School, her footsteps echoed with a new authority, a sound that spoke of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. The transformation was far from complete, and the consequences of this afternoon's confrontation were yet to be fully understood. But something irreversible had happened in room 237. Something that would ripple outward through the school community like stones thrown into still water. Jessica Martinez had shown her true face to her tormentors, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. Outside, the October rain continued to fall, washing away the last remnants of pretense and leaving behind something raw and real and dangerous. The quiet teacher had finally found her voice, and tomorrow would reveal whether the world was ready to listen. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds that had settled over Riverside like a gray blanket, casting the school parking lot in muted tones that matched Jessica's mood as she pulled her aging Honda Civic into her designated spot. She had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, replaying the events in room 237 and trying to predict what consequences would emerge from her moment of revelation. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by dreams, where she found herself back in the Marine Corps, surrounded by the familiar sounds of military life that felt both comforting and terrifying in equal measure. As Jessica gathered her teaching materials from the passenger seat, she noticed that her hands were steadier than they had been in months. The chronic tremor that had developed during her first year at Riverside, a physical manifestation of constant anxiety and stress, had disappeared completely. She flexed her fingers experimentally, marveling at the absence of the nervous energy that had become such a constant companion. Whatever else had changed yesterday afternoon, her body seemed to have remembered something important about confidence and control. The walk from the parking lot to the main entrance of Riverside Middle School felt different this morning. Jessica's usual hurried shuffle had been replaced by a measured stride that suggested purpose rather than panic. Other faculty members, arriving for the day, offered their typical polite nods and distracted greetings, but several seemed to look at her with slightly more attention than usual, as if they sensed some subtle transformation that they couldn't quite identify. Principal Catherine Brennan was waiting for Jessica just inside the main office, her expression carefully neutral in the way that administrators perfected when delivering potentially uncomfortable news. Catherine was a woman in her late 50s, who had spent her entire career in education, working her way up from classroom teacher to district administrator before accepting the principal position at Riverside 5 years earlier. She possessed the kind of professional competence that came from decades of managing adolescent chaos, but she had always treated Jessica with the slightly patronizing kindness reserved for faculty members, who were considered more liability than asset. "Jessica," Catherine said, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced casualness that immediately put people on edge, "could I see you in my office for a few minutes before first period?" The request was phrased as a question, but both women understood that it was actually a command. Jessica nodded and followed Catherine through the maze of administrative desks toward the principal's private office, acutely aware of the curious glances from secretaries and office assistants who clearly sensed that something significant was about to unfold. Catherine's office was a monument to educational bureaucracy, with walls covered in certificates, awards, and photographs documenting her long career in public service. Behind her desk, a window offered a view of the school's central courtyard, where maintenance crews were already working to clear away the debris left by yesterday's storm. Catherine gestured for Jessica to take a seat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs that faced the desk, then settled into her own high-backed, leather chair with the careful precision of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "I received some interesting phone calls last night," Catherine began, opening a manila folder that contained what appeared to be several printed emails and handwritten notes. "It seems that there was some kind of incident in your classroom yesterday afternoon involving Marcus Thompson, Dylan Carter, and Brianna Walsh." She looked up from the folder, her gray eyes studying Jessica's face for any sign of guilt or defensiveness. Jessica met Catherine's gaze steadily, her expression calm and attentive. "There was a confrontation, yes," she said, her voice carrying none of the usual apologetic undertones that had characterized her previous interactions with administration. 3 students remained in my classroom after the final bell and became increasingly aggressive when I asked them to leave. The words were delivered with the clinical precision of someone giving a military briefing, facts presented without embellishment or emotional coloring. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly at Jessica's tone, and she made a note in the margin of one of the papers before continuing. "According to Brianna Walsh's mother, you physically assaulted Marcus Thompson and threatened all 3 students with violence. She's demanding that you be immediately suspended pending a full investigation." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Catherine waited to see how Jessica would respond to this serious allegation. "That's not accurate," Jessica replied, her voice remaining steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Marcus Thompson grabbed my wrist without permission and refused to release me when I asked him to. I used a pressure point technique to make him let go, which is a standard self-defense response to unwanted physical contact. As for threatening them, I simply informed them that I had military training and would defend myself if they continued their aggressive behavior." She folded her hands in her lap and maintained eye contact with Catherine, projecting the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. Catherine's expression shifted slightly, and she consulted another paper in the folder. "Military training?" she asked, her voice taking on a new note of interest. "Jessica, your personnel file makes no mention of military service. According to your application and references, you went straight from undergraduate studies to your teaching certification program." The implication was clear. Either Jessica was lying now, or she had misrepresented herself when she was hired. I served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps before pursuing my teaching degree, Jessica said, her voice taking on a formality that hadn't been there moments before. I was a hand-to-hand combat instructor with the rank of Staff Sergeant. I chose not to include that information on my application because I wanted to be evaluated as an educator, not as a former military personnel. The explanation was truthful. As far as it went, though it omitted the complex personal reasons that had led her to bury her military identity so completely. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she processed this new information. 8 years, she repeated slowly, as a combat instructor. That's quite a significant omission, Jessica. It raises questions about what else you might not have disclosed during the hiring process. The accusation was delivered gently, but its implications were serious enough to end a teaching career. Before Jessica could respond, there was a sharp knock on the office door, followed immediately by the entrance of Robert Chen, Riverside's head of security. Robert was a compact man in his 40s with the alert bearing of someone who had spent years in law enforcement before transitioning to school security. He carried a tablet computer and wore the slightly grim expression of someone delivering unwelcome news. Principal Brennan, Robert said, nodding politely to both women. I've completed my review of the security footage from yesterday's incident. I think you need to see this before making any decisions about disciplinary action. He moved to the side of Catherine's desk and positioned his tablet so both women could see the screen. The footage from room 237's security camera was grainy, but clear enough to show the sequence of events that had unfolded the previous afternoon. Catherine and Jessica watched in silence as the 3 students surrounded Jessica's desk, knocked over her supplies, and escalated their harassment to physical intimidation. The audio quality was poor, but their aggressive body language and threatening gestures were unmistakable. When the video reached the moment where Marcus grabbed Jessica's wrist, Catherine leaned forward to get a better view. The footage clearly showed Marcus initiating physical contact, pulling Jessica closer to him in what could only be interpreted as an aggressive manner. Jessica's response was so quick that it was difficult to follow on the low-resolution recording, but the result was obvious. Marcus immediately released her and stumbled backward, clutching his arm in apparent pain. As you can see, Robert said, pausing the video at the moment when Marcus first made contact with Jessica, Ms. Martinez was clearly defending herself against unwanted physical contact. The 3 students had already engaged in harassment and destruction of property before the physical confrontation began. In my professional opinion, Ms. Martinez showed remarkable restraint in dealing with what could have been a much more serious situation. Catherine stared at the frozen image on the screen, her expression cycling through surprise, concern, and what might have been a grudging respect. How long had this harassment been going on? She asked, looking directly at Jessica. Why didn't you report these students' behavior through proper channels? Jessica considered her response carefully, knowing that her answer would likely determine whether she kept her job or found herself looking for a new career. The harassment has been ongoing for several months, she said finally. I didn't report it because I hoped I could handle the situation through classroom management and because I didn't want to be seen as unable to control my students. I realize now that was a mistake. The admission was painful but necessary, acknowledging her own role in allowing the situation to escalate. Robert cleared his throat and consulted his tablet again. There's something else, Principal Brennan. I pulled footage from the hallway cameras for the past month, and this pattern of harassment extends well beyond yesterday's incident. These 3 students have been systematically targeting Ms. Martinez for weeks, and it's all documented. He swiped through several video clips showing Marcus Dillon and Brianna engaging in various forms of intimidation and disrespectful behavior. Catherine's expression grew increasingly troubled as she watched the compilation of incidents. Why wasn't any of this brought to my attention? She asked, though the question seemed to be directed more at herself than at the others in the room. How did we miss such a clear pattern of student misconduct? Because Ms. Martinez never filed a complaint, Robert replied, his tone suggesting that he had asked himself the same question. And because these 3 students were careful to limit their most aggressive behavior to times when there weren't other teachers around to witness it. They knew exactly what they were doing. The implication was clear. Marcus, Dylan, and Brianna had been conducting a calculated campaign of harassment, not engaging in random acts of adolescent misbehavior. Jessica felt a strange sense of vindication watching Catherine and Robert grapple with the evidence of what she had endured. For months, she had questioned her own perceptions, wondering if she was being overly sensitive or if the harassment was as serious as it felt. The security footage provided objective confirmation that her experience had been real and substantial. "There's one more thing," Robert continued, his expression growing even more serious. "After the incident yesterday, I did some background checking on these students. Marcus Thompson has been involved in several incidents of physical intimidation at his previous school, though nothing was formally documented. Dylan Carter was suspended twice last year for harassment of female students. And Brianna Walsh's mother has a history of threatening legal action against teachers who discipline her daughter." The pattern he was describing suggested that yesterday's confrontation was not an isolated incident but part of a larger behavioral pattern. Catherine closed the folder on her desk and looked directly at Jessica. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice carrying genuine remorse. "We failed you as an administration. These students should have been identified and dealt with long before things reached this point." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts before continuing. "However, that doesn't address the larger issue of your undisclosed military background and the questions it raises about your hiring." Jessica straightened in her chair, recognizing that this was the moment when her future at Riverside would be determined. "Principal Brennan," she said, her voice taking on the formal tone she had perfected during military briefings, "I understand your concerns about my failure to disclose my military service. I made that decision because I believed my past was irrelevant to my ability to teach mathematics. Yesterday's events proved that I was wrong." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "If you decide that my omission is grounds for termination, I'll accept that decision. But I want you to know that every day I've spent at Riverside, I've tried to be the best teacher I could be within the limitations I set for myself." Catherine was quiet for several long moments, her fingers drumming silently on the desk as she considered her options. The revelation of Jessica's military background complicated everything, creating both problems and opportunities that she hadn't anticipated when she'd planned this conversation. "Your military training," she said finally. "How extensive was it? What exactly did you do during your 8 years of service?" "I was primarily responsible for training Marines in hand-to-hand combat techniques," Jessica replied. "But my duties also included instruction in situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation strategies. I held certifications in multiple martial arts disciplines and was qualified to train personnel in everything from basic self-defense to advanced combat techniques." The summary was clinical and professional, but it conveyed the breadth of knowledge and experience that Jessica had acquired during her military career. Robert looked impressed despite himself. "That explains how you were able to neutralize Marcus's aggression so effectively," he said. "Most people in that situation would have either panicked or escalated the confrontation. You managed to stop the immediate threat without causing serious injury." His professional assessment carried the weight of someone who understood the complexities of managing physical confrontations. Catherine's expression had shifted from concern to something that might have been calculation. "Jessica," she said, "I'm going to be frank with you. This school has been struggling with increasingly aggressive student behavior for the past 2 years. We've had 3 teachers resign due to harassment and intimidation, and our disciplinary measures don't seem to be having the desired effect. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. Your military background, properly disclosed and appropriately utilized, might actually be an asset rather than a liability. The suggestion hung in the air, and Jessica felt a familiar stirring of the competence and authority that had defined her military identity. What are you proposing? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction Catherine's thoughts were taking. I'm proposing that we turn this crisis into an opportunity, Catherine replied, her voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered a solution to a long-standing problem. Rather than hiding your background, I want you to consider developing a conflict resolution and anti-bullying program based on your military training. We could pilot it here at Riverside and potentially expand it throughout the district. The idea was ambitious and unconventional, but it addressed real needs that traditional educational approaches had failed to meet. Jessica felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight control she had maintained over her identity for the past several years. You want me to integrate my military training into my teaching role? She asked, seeking clarification of what Catherine was suggesting. I want you to stop hiding who you are, Catherine replied simply. Your military experience gives you tools that most educators don't have. Instead of pretending those tools don't exist, let's figure out how to use them constructively. The proposal was radical enough to be either brilliant or disastrous, but it offered a path forward that Jessica hadn't considered. Before Jessica could respond, Catherine's phone rang with the harsh tone that indicated an urgent call from the main office. She answered with her usual professional greeting, but her expression quickly changed to one of alarm. When did this happen? She asked, grabbing a pen to take notes. Are the parents on their way? Yes, I'll be right there. She hung up the phone and looked at Jessica and Robert with obvious concern. We have a problem, Catherine said, already rising from her chair. Marcus Thompson is in the nurse's office claiming that he can't feel his right arm. His parents are driving him to the emergency room, and they're talking about pressing charges for assault. The news hit the room like a physical blow, transforming yesterday's confrontation from a disciplinary matter into a potential legal crisis. Jessica felt her stomach drop as the implications of Marcus's condition became clear. The pressure point technique she had used was designed to cause temporary pain and muscle weakness, not permanent damage. If Marcus was experiencing prolonged numbness, something had gone wrong in a way that could destroy her career and potentially result in criminal charges. That's not possible, Jessica said, her professional training warring with her growing panic. The technique I used affects nerve pathways temporarily. Any numbness should have resolved within minutes. Even as she spoke, she was mentally reviewing the sequence of events, trying to identify what might have caused an unexpected reaction. Robert was already pulling up additional security footage on his tablet. Let me see if I can get a clearer view of exactly what happened, he said, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. If there's going to be a legal investigation, we need to understand every detail of the physical interaction. Catherine grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. I need to deal with the immediate crisis, she said over her shoulder. Jessica, I want you to stay here and work with Robert to document everything that happened. We'll continue our conversation about your future role here once we get through this emergency. The unspoken message was clear. Depending on the severity of Marcus's injury, there might not be a future role to discuss. As Catherine's footsteps faded down the hallway, Jessica found herself alone with Robert and the growing weight of consequence that she had hoped to avoid. The security guard was studying his tablet with the intense focus of someone searching for crucial evidence, while Jessica replayed yesterday's confrontation in her mind, looking for any detail that might explain Marcus's continued symptoms. There, Robert said suddenly, pointing to a specific moment in the video. Can you walk me through exactly what you did here? I need to understand the technique you used so I can document it accurately for the investigation. His tone was professional, but not accusatory, suggesting that he was trying to help rather than gather evidence against her. Jessica moved closer to the tablet and watched herself respond to Marcus's aggressive grab. The video quality made it difficult to see precise details, but the general sequence was clear. "I applied pressure to a specific nerve cluster just below the elbow," she explained, her voice taking on the instructional tone she had used when training Marines. "It's designed to cause immediate pain and temporary weakness in the arm, forcing an attacker to release their grip. The effect should last no more than a few minutes." Robert nodded, making notes on a separate device. Could there be any factors that might cause the technique to have a longer-lasting effect? He asked. Medical conditions, medications, anything that might make someone more susceptible to nerve manipulation? The question sparked a memory from Jessica's military training, a cautionary lecture about the complications that could arise when applying combat techniques to individuals with certain medical conditions. If someone has a pre-existing nerve condition or is taking certain medications, the effects could potentially be prolonged, she said slowly, the implications of this possibility beginning to dawn on her. But I had no way of knowing about any medical issues Marcus might have. Robert's expression grew thoughtful. "We might need to access Marcus's medical records," he said, "assuming his parents give permission and this becomes a formal investigation. If he has a documented condition that would make him more susceptible to this kind of injury, it could be relevant to determining liability." The suggestion offered a potential avenue of defense, but it also highlighted how complex the legal situation might become. The sound of raised voices from the main office interrupted their discussion, and both Jessica and Robert could hear the unmistakable tone of angry parents demanding immediate action. Through the thin walls of the administrative suite, they could make out fragments of conversation that included words like assault, lawsuit, and criminal charges. The gravity of the situation was escalating by the minute. "I should probably call my union representative," Jessica said, the practical implications of her predicament finally sinking in. "If this becomes a legal matter, I'm going to need professional advice about how to protect myself." The admission felt like a defeat, acknowledging that her attempt to maintain a quiet, unremarkable life had failed spectacularly. Robert nodded sympathetically. "That's probably a good idea," he agreed. "But I want you to know that from a security perspective, you did everything right yesterday. You tried to de-escalate the situation verbally. You only used physical force. When you were physically attacked, and you used the minimum force necessary to stop the threat. Any reasonable investigation should recognize that you were defending yourself." The reassurance was comforting, but Jessica knew that legal proceedings didn't always follow the path of reason. Public perception, media coverage, and political considerations could all influence the outcome of a case involving a teacher and student, regardless of the objective facts. Her military background, which Catherine had just suggested could be an asset, might instead be portrayed as evidence that she was too dangerous to work with children. The office door opened again, and Catherine returned with the harried expression of someone who had just spent 20 minutes trying to calm irate parents. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, gathering her composure. Before addressing Jessica and Robert, "The Thompsons are taking Marcus to Children's Hospital for a complete neurological evaluation," Catherine reported, her voice carefully controlled. "They've already contacted an attorney, and they're demanding that Jessica be immediately suspended without pay pending a criminal investigation." The news was as bad as Jessica had feared, confirming that this incident was going to have far-reaching consequences. Jessica felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to collapse around her. The quiet anonymity she had sought at Riverside was gone forever, replaced by the kind of public scrutiny that she had hoped to escape. "I understand," she said quietly, the weight of resignation settling over her like a heavy blanket. "When do you need me to clear out my classroom?" Catherine held up a hand, her expression suggesting that Jessica's assumption might be premature. "I'm not suspending you," she said firmly. "Not yet, anyway. The security footage clearly shows that you were defending yourself against an unprovoked attack. Until we know more about Marcus's condition and the medical factors involved, I'm not going to take disciplinary action based solely on his parents' demands." The decision was courageous and potentially costly, showing a level of support that Jessica hadn't expected. Robert looked up from his tablet with a new expression of interest. "Principal Brennan," he said, "I think you should see this. I pulled Marcus Thompson's disciplinary file from the system, and there's something here that might be relevant." He turned the screen so Catherine could see whatever information he had discovered. Catherine read quickly, her eyebrows rising as she processed the contents of Marcus's file. "According to this," she said slowly, "Marcus has a documented history of claiming injury after physical confrontations. He accused a student at his previous school of causing permanent damage to his shoulder, but medical examination revealed no injury. The complaint was dropped when security footage showed that Marcus had initiated the altercation. The pattern suggested that Marcus's current claims might be part of a familiar strategy rather than a genuine medical emergency." Jessica felt a spark of hope for the first time since learning about Marcus's hospital visit. "You think he might be exaggerating his symptoms?" she asked, hardly daring to believe that her situation might not be as dire as it had appeared. "I think we need to be very careful about jumping to conclusions," Catherine replied diplomatically, "but this information definitely needs to be part of any investigation. If Marcus has a pattern of making false injury claims, it casts his current allegations in a different light." She closed the file and looked directly at Jessica. "Which brings us back to the question of your future here at Riverside." The conversation had come full circle, but the context had changed dramatically. What had begun as a disciplinary meeting about undisclosed military service had evolved into a complex situation involving potential criminal charges, false accusations, and the revelation of systemic problems with student harassment. Jessica realized that her response to Catherine's earlier proposal about developing an anti-bullying program would be influenced by factors she hadn't considered an hour ago. "If you're still interested in my input on conflict resolution," Jessica said carefully, "I think yesterday's incident demonstrates both the need for such a program and the risks involved in implementing it. Students like Marcus Dillon and Brianna aren't just engaging in typical adolescent behavior. They're conducting sophisticated campaigns of intimidation that require equally sophisticated responses." The analysis was clinical and professional, reflecting her military training in threat assessment. Catherine leaned forward, her expression indicating genuine interest in Jessica's perspective. "What would such a response look like?" she asked. "How would you design a program that could effectively address this kind of systematic harassment?" Jessica felt her military training engaging with the educational challenge, creating possibilities that hadn't existed when she was trying to hide her background. "It would need to operate on multiple levels," she said, her voice taking on the authority of someone speaking from experience. "Prevention through education about power dynamics and respect. Early intervention when problematic behaviors are identified. And yes, when necessary, the kind of firm response that makes it clear that harassment and intimidation will not be tolerated." The framework she was describing drew from both her military experience and her 3 years of observing the failures of traditional disciplinary approaches. Robert nodded approvingly. "That makes sense from a security standpoint," he said. "The current system is purely reactive. By the time we're dealing with incidents like yesterday's, the pattern of behavior is already well established. Prevention and early intervention could stop problems before they reach the crisis point." His professional endorsement carried weight, suggesting that Jessica's approach might have practical applications beyond theoretical appeal. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text message, and she glanced at it with obvious concern. The Thompsons. Attorney wants to meet with me this afternoon, she reported. They're threatening to go to the media if we don't take immediate action against Jessica. The escalation represented a new phase in the crisis, one that would extend far beyond the walls of Riverside Middle School. Jessica felt the familiar calm that had always descended on her during military briefings about dangerous missions. The external pressure was intense, but her training had prepared her for situations where the stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. Principal Brennan, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had made a decision. I want to fight this. Not just for my own career, but because giving in to the Thompsons' demands would send a message to every bully in this school that teachers are powerless to defend themselves. The declaration surprised everyone in the room, including Jessica herself. For 3 years, she had chosen accommodation over confrontation, hoping that compliance would earn her the peaceful existence she craved. Yesterday's incident had shattered that illusion, revealing that some conflicts could not be avoided through submission and good intentions. Catherine studied Jessica's face, seeming to recognize something that hadn't been there before. If you're serious about fighting this, she said slowly, you're going to need more than just security footage and union support. You're going to need a strategy that addresses not just the legal aspects, but the public relations battle as well. The warning was sobering, acknowledging that modern controversies were fought as much in the court of public opinion as in actual courtrooms. Then let's develop that strategy, Jessica replied, her military training automatically shifting into planning mode. What resources do we have available, and what are our opponents' likely tactics? The questions reflected a fundamental change in Jessica's approach to the situation. Moving from defensive reaction to proactive engagement, Robert consulted his tablet again and began pulling up additional information. The good news is that we have extensive documentation of the harassment pattern and clear evidence that you were defending yourself, he said. The challenging news is that Marcus's family has resources and connections that most parents don't have. His father is a partner in a prominent law firm, and his mother serves on the school board in the next district over. The intelligence briefing painted a picture of opponents who were both motivated and well-equipped for a prolonged battle. Jessica absorbed this information with the analytical detachment she had learned during military intelligence training. What about allies? She asked. Are there parents, students, or community members who might support our position? The question reflected her understanding that successful campaigns required building coalitions rather than fighting in isolation. Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. Actually, she said, there might be more support than you realize. I've received several emails from parents this morning expressing concern about bullying at Riverside. Some of them specifically mentioned that their children had told them about the harassment you've been experiencing. The revelation suggested that Jessica's situation was not as isolated as she had believed. There's something else, Robert added, scrolling through information on his screen. I checked social media this morning, and there are already posts from students who witnessed yesterday's incident. Most of them are supportive of you, describing Marcus and his friends as bullies who finally got what they deserved. The grassroots support was encouraging, though Jessica knew that public opinion could shift quickly in the age of viral content. As the three of them continued to discuss strategy and resources, Jessica felt a transformation taking place that went beyond the immediate crisis. For the first time since leaving the Marine Corps, she was engaging with a challenge that required the full range of her skills and experience. The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating, representing a return to the kind of purposeful action that had defined her military career. The morning sun had finally broken through the cloud cover, sending shafts of golden light through Catherine's office windows and illuminating the small group of allies who had unexpectedly assembled to face an uncertain future. Whatever the outcome of the legal and public relations battle ahead, Jessica knew that she had already won something important: the courage to stop hiding from herself and start fighting for what she believed was right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.